Mindcrime Liberty Show with me, Stephen Dobson, and Henderson Pan. Today we discuss, does humility exist? Tim.
Humility is one of those virtues which many Christians, in particular Bishop Barron, who I was recently watching, interviewed by Lex Freedom, was praising. I'm very suspicious of this virtue to be somewhat Randian in the sense. Humility could just mean accurate accounting of one's skills, and in this way, humble just means, for the most part, somewhat stupid, because there's plenty of things you don't know. You could be, if you're stupid yet self-aware, which is roughly the Socratic position. Socrates is famous for saying, the only thing I know is that I don't know anything, or some version of that. But in this regard, even he isn't per se stupid. He knows some things. He probably knows more than many people. Hence, in many circumstances, humility is just sort of like functional, accurate accounting of one's skills. Like, I don't know anything about ancient Chinese history or something like, or hardly anything. If someone asked me how to fix a car, I would say I know nothing. Again, that's just functional accounting. I don't know anything. But if someone asked me how to make a Podbean account, I would tell them I know more than most. So in that sense, humility can just be used in practical terms. And I have no objection to this. Now, is this what Bishop Barron and some of the Catholic defenders of humility mean? I'm not sure. There is a good article which sort of goes through a lot of the errors that you could do, which I'm going to name. But even so, the errors of humility seem likely here. And to go back to the Rand thing here, this is where I think the sort of, some like Ric Flair type attitude of what you know is quite good here. Now, speaking of humility, oftentimes when you're dealing with, this is sort of the political aspect of this, is like recently in the last 2 years with the various measures, we'll say, you were supposed to trust the experts, so to speak. Like in this sense, the experts aren't acting humble, so to speak, but we, the proles and the pharmaceutical consumers, must be humble towards the experts, grovel. So in this sense, humility is oftentimes used rather, I would argue, perniciously. It's one of the reasons why I'm a right-wing Foucauldian here, in the sense that, if you're going to critique systems of knowledge as just systems of power here, in that sense, you have like, I was recently, Zero Hedge had an article detailing a BBC document, thank goodness for the taxpayers of England, about vaccines, and they showed a few clips from it, and it's like, wow, this is cringy and terrible. This might be so bad it's good, but they were clearly using their authority here, their sort of priestly authority here. In that sense, they were all like, they had one skeptic and they had a panel of six, priestly experts there and things like that. So in this sense, humility, you could argue that the state needs humility, or the experts here. And there was also a number of related areas here. Is I was watching Graham Oppie. Graham Oppie had a good debate with Ed Feser, as well as William Lane Craig. And Graham Oppie at times is a very smart agnostic insofar as, he's like, what kind of argument would convince me that God exists? Now, to be fair, I don't want to put words in his mouth, but he more or less sees that it's too many deities here, and he was arguing that the theistic position is actually the unhumble position. The agnostic position is the more humble position here, which I always thought was interesting to sort of to circumspose with Bishop Barron. Bishop Barron was just quoting a 16th or 17th century Catholic. He might even been quoting Thomas Aquinas. I forget who Barron was quoting in the Lex Friedman interview here, but in that sense, you could argue that like skepticism might be the more humble position, not Ed Feser's, theism, or something like that. Which I thought was interesting here because, you could take humility too far in the sort of theological realm. You end up with agnosticism. I don't know anything. How would I know that? If I don't know it, then why do I need to, follow along, so to speak, with the story and everything else that goes along with it here? So I think that's a very interesting insight here. So Swith and I sort of made some interesting, what I thought was interesting ramblings I noticed on humility here. The Randians are very much anti-humble, anti-turn your cheek. And a lot of like the left-wing Christians, I would say in practice, this is sort of like a performative contradiction. Sorry to go on another quick aside. I was reading I was just Googled humility, actually DuckDuckGo to humility. And not that DuckDuckGo is probably any better, but I was just reading an article about it. And then on the article was a lot of nice flowery language about being humble. But then the author description says, I am a self-employed web designer, a pioneer in the blogosphere, widely read and recognized blogs. I left out his names, but I got a kick out of it because like that, there's a sort of like performative contradiction at the end here where, and like people like David Bentley Hart would be another one who doesn't shy away from a good polemic at all, which is I'm fine with brash polemics. I think they're enjoyable to read as well. So humility, is it a virtue? Does it exist or just misapplied? Swithin?
Well, I would agree with you largely that humility consists in having an accurate assessment of one's own abilities. That would seem, I think, to be the appropriate way of looking at it. Now, in a theological sense, one of the differences, and why that may be stressed more than, say, with the in sort of Christian theology rather than it is in, say, Rand's sphere, is the idea that in sort of Christian theology or monotheism to a large degree is the idea that every individual is sort of dependent on God in sort of metaphysical sense, and without the existence of God, then we wouldn't exist either. And so there's a radical dependence and difference between the individual human and God, and so therefore the human should view himself appropriately with that metaphysical reality. Whereas if you take the atheist position, well, I suppose you could say you should be humble before the laws of nature, but that doesn't really have the same sort of entailment. So I think that might account to some extent for the difference in disposition when it comes to humility. Yeah, certainly. I think a lot of it. I generally don't like people talking about humility because it generally just comes off as, oh no, I'm really bad. I'm really humble because I see how poor I am at this. It's like, yeah, you just keep going about how humble you are. It's like, this doesn't really seem like you're hugely humble because you're going about how humble you are. So it's kind of an odd one virtue to focus on, I would say. Now, I do think you make an interesting point with skepticism and sort of agnosticism, refers to Graham Oppy. I think there's a type of skepticism which is actually, well, I suppose you could say arrogant in a sense, although that might be a little strong, but not humble in the way you might think. The reason is this. If you're going to go full skeptic, it's like, so someone says, oh, look, there's a sheep over there. And then you go, oh, yes, but is it really a sheep? How do you know it's a sheep? Is it not a trick of the mind? Does the external world exist? And the only real reason why anybody entertained that is probably because they're pretty intelligent, and that they can come up with arguments as to why their sensory faculties are grossly in error. I mean, most people recognize that you might make a mistake, but Descartes was pretty clever. I mean, you're not going to come up with a lot of objections to how all sensory perception could be false, and we have to start at an indubitable starting point. That is something which is a hallmark of high level of acumen. Whether it's right or wrong is another question. But it's not the same as sort of like common sense realism. essentially, or direct realism, which you could say is like the least humble position. Sorry, the most humble position, is direct realism or naive realism. It's called naive realism. Because that's just what everyone kind of expects. Like, well, yeah, of course the external world exists. Yeah, because beer exists in my hand, etc. The question would then be, with respect to God, would being an agnostic be more humble or otherwise? I don't think so. If you take what would be required as the tenets which would justify some more sort of common sense realist position. Let's say the principle of causation to some extent, which is, something must, everything that exists has sort of an explanation for why it exists, and we can reasonably ask that question forever. And so we have to get to, so this isn't really the causation, I'm just really arguing from contingency. But I do think it's based on some sort of realism. I'm going to go, okay, there must be something on the bottom of things, which something at the bottom of everything, which explains its own existence. Otherwise, you get a regress. Now, I suppose you could say that's somewhat of a sophisticated argument, although I do think it's less unhumble than positing brute facts, which eventually Offie does. In that, there's these mereological symbols. No, they just exist. And it's like, yeah, but why do they exist? So I actually think, to a large extent, the agnosticism in that sense, unless you're going to go for a completely different approach, which I haven't come across to my knowledge, it kind of ends up not being humble, I think, because you just sort of steadfastly refuse to answer a particular question as to why do the mereological symbols exist, what explains their existence, why they start. So I don't think skepticism in that sense is necessarily more humble. I would, though, say skepticism when it comes to sort of empirical reality and sort of like modeling, etc., I think that is significantly more humble. I mean, because it's obvious that the external world and social phenomenon is very complex and quite chaotic. And the idea that somehow you can realistically model the effects of coronavirus lockdowns when you didn't even have a decent idea as to what the infection fatality rate was, or even could easily and clearly diagnose who actually died of the disease. Clearly, I think it's a much more humble position to go, actually, no, there's lots of questions you simply can't answer. And so to be skeptical of that, I think, is a more humble position and not sort of believing the experts. But it would be, I think, is a question of one of domain, which I think we got into to some extent in our experts episode there. I do think, though, to switch on a slightly different topic, humility is interesting in the context of advertising. You pointed out on the document you sent me to Tim Challies, who's a Christian author, who then who describes himself as Tim Challies, self-employed web designer, is a pioneer in the Christian blogosphere, having one of the most widely read and recognized Christian blogs. He's also the editor of Discerning Reader, a site dedicated to offering thoughtful reviews of books that are of interest to Christians. Is that unhumble? Well, was he a pioneer? He might have been. Is he most widely read? He might be, unrecognized. But then the question is are there things that you can kind of say about yourself which are true, but again misleading? Is this, in a sense, misleading and leading you to believe he has a higher ability or recognition than he actually does? It's not obvious. But also when it comes to advertising, I don't think anybody would reasonably say that you have to disclose all information about something you're selling. You know, if you were to sell something, it's not fraudulent, but you might not disclose that actually, no, it didn't work twice in the dim and distant past, but you think it might do in the future. I mean, you're obligated to say so. I mean, is that sort of like misrepresenting the product? Now I know that's not about you, for instance, but let's think on health reasons. I suppose you've gone off ill or whatever, you haven't disclosed to a new employer. Is that unhumble because you're trying to pass yourself off as some sort of great superhero when it comes a superhero sort of body that doesn't break or get ill? So job interviews and things like that, I think is interesting here. Any comments on my ramblings?
Well, humility, I think you'd also demonstrate that humility has multiple levels, because you have on the one level, you have this sort of practical level where people claim humility is a virtue. Sometimes I think it is a virtue. Sometimes I think it's a vice, where people, and sometimes it just turns into humble brag competitions, which are just sort of like reverse dick measuring contests, which, in practice is what at times, if this is sort of like Rand's, this is where I think Rand is a good, Rand and I've been like 8 years since I've read her fiction books. Rand's fiction. I remember the themes, not the stories, but like Rand's characters are very Ric Flair like, at least the protagonists. And she sort of critiques this sort of, and she roots it in Christianity that people, this is where the guilt culture also comes in, and the shame, things like that. People just aren't proud of their own accomplishments, and things, and they sort of are overly deferential. And I think that's a very true insight here. So there's a practical level which quickly scales quite up into sort of more macro level phenomena here. I think so. Like if Jim Challies is a pioneer, then he should say he's a pioneer. He shouldn't say the opposite. He should say, I mean, that would be technically lying. If he said he's, unless of course he is committing fraud, then it's fraud. So on that level, I think humility is a very tricky thing here. It's very context oriented, which is sort of an annoying thing to say. But that's far. As far as the point about Gnosticism with respect to Ed Feser and Christianity. Ed Feser has commented on Ayn Rand's existence exist axioms here. And again, this is where they're always critical of her insofar as they view her as sort of a rube in a sense that she's, not she's not a continental philosopher. She's not an Aquinas. She's not an Aquinas scholar. She's sort of just a rube who has a last name after a typewriter, the Rand Typewriter Corporation. But I do think the existence exist axioms are relevant insofar as she's now, whether she's actually now she's an atheist. And as I pointed this out to Todd Lewis in our epistemology episode we did 6 years ago, some of my first episodes I ever did a line. She's sort of like a right-wing anti-postmodernist. She's an atheist anti-postmodernist. She doesn't like this sort of hyper skepticism. And to go back to Graham Oppy, when I watch him go after theists, he seems to imply that you can't see God, and you can't see some of these abstract elements, so you may as well just assume they not exist, because you can't touch them. You're implying this level which may or may not exist here. And on top of that, if you're doing that on the grounds that humility is a virtue, it's even harder to do, because you're making a fairly complex argument on causes and change and movement to imply there's some necessary being. Now you could argue that Oppy ends up with other issues down the road by just positing, the things just have to exist or something like that. But if humility is a virtue, or now the Catholic Answers website says it's not one of the cardinal virtues, but Bishop Barron is sort of like the default bishop of the Anglosphere Catholic internet. He was, and Lex Fried is very much of a Randy in this regard too. He's so those are my thoughts on your thoughts on humility here. I would say that it's overrated, which is a common word I use here. That maybe, except for the state needs to act more humble. That would be the state, and state actors need to act more humble. But if you are a pioneer, or if you are very successful, or you think of yourself as fairly knowledgeable, you should say it. Now you might not actually be, or there might not be a good test to measure what a pioneer or what somebody successful is. So those are my thoughts on humility in respect to the some of the discussion on Ed Feser. Swithin, any comments?
No, I would agree. If you are good at something, you say you're good at something. I mean, like, well, you are. I mean, it's clear accounting. I suppose, again, the difference, say, between sort of, say, let's let's go the Randian and the Christian Randian. I'm sure no the Randians. Is again, you could posit that, well, in comparison to X, I've in comparison to God, I'm clearly not very. I'm not great in comparison to them. And also, you could say, and again, you could argue this is humble. You could say, actually, yeah, I know what I'm doing. I'm not an expert in it, but I can do a reasonable amount. Now, that might be a humble way of saying something accurate. You're not necessarily just diminishing your ability. You're just explaining in context. Yeah, okay, I know a decent amount, but there are people who know more than me, which I think would be accurate. So I think it depends on kind of disposition and how you would how you go about that. I think. One interesting thing with humility, you mentioned to me in the past, is do you think that you mentioned that certain people groups in the past have complained about ostentatious displays of wealth, but those are somehow unhumble and sort of grandiose. Do you think that humility kind of applies to external objects that you decide to adorn yourself with or to buy? Or do you think that's sort of a misapplication of the concept of humility? Or can you have, say, a humble car or a humble house?
That's a good question. The Warren Buffett supposedly still lives in the same house he lived in like in like the 80s, and he's like one of the 20 richest people. And there's also some older artwork that's in, like, I think in Antwerp. It's a fairly famous painting, and they're sort of like an upper middle class, but they're sort of dressed very unostentatiously. So should you have should you have ostentatious? You could just argue that it's just a style. I'm not sure if can you what in what way you're meaning, like, 'cause like Trump, for example. He's a sort of like he has like a gold plated bathroom.
Yeah,
And
yeah. The gold plated bathroom, or the fictitious gold plated Shark Tank from Lars Ulrich from one of the anti-IP South Park episodes.
And in what way are you? What's
Well,
the
is it unhumble to have like the gold plated room, or is this sort of represent? So I mean, another thing with humility here, which is sort of similar. There was always a tradition, I think it was in Islam, or actually also in some cathedral buildings, that the artists, the sort of masons, I'm not sure the masons, but the people who are doing like the tiles and stuff would deliberately make an error on it, because they would want to show, well, no, this is made by human hands, we're fallible, we're not God. So that would be a sort of a similar situation. But I mean, is it? Well, I mean, so for instance, you could say Trump, for instance, is aesthetically vulgar, but is being aesthetically vulgar in an expensive sense sort of an indication? Well, not necessarily unhumble in and of itself, but does that lead to show you have an arrogant disposition, or is it merely bad aesthetics? When it comes to clothes, I think the reason they ended up not being as ostentatious from the upper class as they were historically is basically the French Revolution, and they sort of kind of toned it down. And that's, I think, from like the 18th century, that's when the suit becomes sort of ubiquitous, and the suit, even like the tuxedo and stuff, is actually a pretty sober form of dress, especially in comparison to the stuff the aristocrats would have worn in the sort of pre-17th century era. So what do you think? Can clothes be humble or unhumble?
Well, aesthetics are an interesting thing. I probably don't have much of an opine on that too much. I will say that too much is Trump just being vulgar here. Well, I don't really care either way. I mean, I will say that like I think in the long run, you know, in this sense, the Protestants were wrong. I think all those beautiful, ostentatious cathedrals in Europe, and some of them in like Latin America too. There's a few of them too. I think they're probably better than the sort of, suburban parking garage church. I think there is something to be said, or even like the Mennonites or Amish have fairly plain buildings. I do think there's something to be. There is a debate over is having something too plain. I think there is a value in time and ostentatious. Whether you're just stealing a bunch of wealth through taxation around you to build these buildings, that's a good question. Whether it could be used for other means. One of the things is like the exterior houses is terrible. Sometimes interior houses, I think, is actually quite nice. It's just the exterior is just sort of looks kind of trashy. So I don't know, clothes. I don't really care. I don't really care too much. In that way. I mean, I don't. The Trump brand is interesting. Like him branding himself is this because like he's the archetypal unhumble person there. He just paints his brand on, and he he puts it on like even like the towels in his hotels supposedly. I think. I don't know. Is that humble? No, probably not. Is that bad? Well, I don't really care in that sense here. I don't really have anything to say on that, Swithin. Swithin?
I think mostly no. Although I think maybe with clothing more than cars, I think because more directly related to you, possibly it is, but only insofar as it tends to show. So, for instance, you might have some guy who thinks he's pretty well built. And he's like, well, he'll then deliberately wear clothing to accentuate his muscles, even though he isn't actually that strong. So, in a sense, that could be unhumble. In a way, although I would treat it more in the sense of aesthetics. So like a woman might go, oh, wear something short because I have amazing legs and because I'm an amazing person. Look, and I just want to flaunt how great I am around. So I suppose because clothing is interesting because it depends when you're wearing it. Because it's like, let's suppose you are a pioneer of blogosphere. Should you wear it on a badge so everyone knows? Look. Everywhere I go, I am a pioneer in the blogosphere. It's like, well, maybe not, because that kind of like is trumpeting your ability too high and taking out the appropriate context. I think context is key. I think there. I think clothing is interesting there as well. It depends when you wear it. I think it makes a difference.
I will say this. I mean, I will say this. With terms of, I'll use a thing I know more about, writing. I would argue that at times people like Hart, even Zan, well, Zan less so. Some of these left-wing Christians that are, somewhat ostensibly left-wing Christians in some ways, for all the talk of humility, they don't write humble. They write very, I would say, ostentatiously, which is fine. In some ways, it's easier to read. It's more entertaining. But in some ways, it's just overly wordy. Like Keith Preston recently vlogged on Facebook. He said, like they have a two-paragraph description. Oh, he's just, like get to the point. So there is a sort of ostentatious writing format here, where you're just sort of like trying to bully over how erudite you are. Like, so you bring up obscure references, or you'll show that how you listen to this black artist or things like that, and it's sort of like in the most you listen to this or that, and speaking of dress, like Tyler Cowen made the argument, which I actually agree with him, that like dress codes. Like, in a way, casual dress is the heart. Like, which are you gonna wear a band T-shirt? Are you gonna wear like a Metallica T-shirt? Like, high school dress is a very contentious area. Are you gonna wear the athletic T-shirt? So for all the talk of humility, you sort of get it. You get sort of it seems like everyone defaults back to what Trump does, and what Trump is doing is just honestly, rather than putting the humble bragging in the back, he's just leading it in the front. So in the sense, I'm sort of like, who cares? Isn't it unavoidable in some sense? Isn't it unavoidable in some sense that you, like, if you are successful or if you are above average at minimum, you're going to display some amount of arrogance, I would argue. I think that's by definition impossible not to do. Swithin?
I think that's possible, although this is a different example. He died relatively recently. It was Roger Moore, the James Bond actor, amongst other actors, who clearly was very successful in what he did. Everything I've heard about him, that he was a really nice guy and had time for everybody. Fans just like see him and sort of talk to them and whatever. He wasn't somebody who would just sort of like ignore you or shrug you off and disappear. Even though he's clearly better than a lot of people acting and significantly more successful. So again, I think it's the sphere that he's in. I mean, now you could argue this is sort of humble bragging to some extent, but it was interesting when it comes to politics. Clearly, most actors and everybody who's sort of in the media is basically lobotomized. But then, who was it? It's the guy who was Hannibal Lecter, Anthony Hopkins, basically said, "Don't listen to actors. Actors are mostly stupid." Now, that might have been a counter signal to say you should believe the opposite of what the actor said, because that's what he believes, but doesn't say what it is. Or it could just be a case of, no, actors are stupid. Talk to them about acting, they know about that, but they don't know about this. So again, I think it's one of domain. I think that's one of the issues probably with people who are very successful in one area. They can, I think, it transfers over to others when it might not. That said, of course, people who are good in one area do tend to be good in other areas. You don't often get people who are only good in one area, although of course it does happen. So I don't think it's necessarily inevitable, but I can see why it would. Why it does happen.
Well, one of the reasons why I want to do this episode here is partly because of Lex Friedman's interview with Bishop Barron, but partly because of the Randian account here. And I see the line between humility. What I do want to make the point with respect to the state. The state is not a humble organization. The state very rarely is a humble organization. Especially in terms of power it's used, and the way it wields it. So in that sense, like if you're like, why are you disagreeing with a state medical expert is a sort of question that sort of gets posited, which, in this sense needs to be like, well, why does that state authority have that power anyway? That's the real question you should ask. Like, why? Of course it's this needs to be flipped entirely here in that context here. We should be able to question them, and it should be given. It's not like you need to have the credentials or whatever to even engage in questioning them. So in that respect, that they're not humble at all. It's the other way around. As far as in sort of practical life here, and I do think there's a relationship here. We do still live in a sort of, this is why I think Moldbug and Rand are interesting, because in a sense they're not Christians, they're Jews, for better or for worse. So they can see outside of it in a certain sense too. But the sort of the humble bragging tendency shows up. I don't know if anyone's ever been to a job interview, but job interviews are also weird, because someone asked me, like, what is your work ethic? And I sort of just hung up on the question, because I was like, this is stupid. This is a stupid question here. Because, like, what do you want me to say here? Like, do you want me to give you a lecture on ethical philosophy here? So it's like, there's a certain sense where everyone has to engage in self-congratulate or self build-up, And again, Rand's very popular as a self-help type thing too here, and I think that's partly because it's taking away the sort of Christian legacy, and particularly the sort of Protestant, Puritan, Calvinist, legacy that's in the society, which in some sense that might be true. It might be the accurate account of theism. Maybe not. Maybe the other accounts are more accurate. But I don't think it's a surprise that there is this kind of it goes into this direction here. And you could always argue that what I'm really doing is saying they're not humble enough. That like I just don't think there's any way. You might not like Hillary Clinton or you might not like Barack Obama, but like in a sense they are successful at gaming the system and enriching themselves and getting political power. So in that way, in that ironic way, I think, oh, that's actually good. That's actually good here. Now, what are they using their power for? That's a good question. But I do think in some ways self-congratulations or self-worship, so to speak, is somewhat unavoidable here. Or you can, on the flip side, you can end up with this, like we did the suicide episode here. On the flip side, you end up with if you don't have enough esteem of yourself and you just think you're so terrible that you're just going to kill yourself. So this is again where I think sort of Rand's account both on the sort of practical level as well as the theoretical level. Now the theoretical level, in this sense, she is a rube in the sense that she's not as educated as, which interestingly goes back to my first point here. Does the official truth just mean the state truth? And that's a good question. So she is, in a sense, doesn't know all the continental philosophers. She doesn't know all the finer points in Aquinas' philosophy. Of course, neither do I either. So maybe her rudeness is the thing which is her feature in this sense. But I do think it's a sort of useful because the common sense definition of humility seems to lead to lots of errors, and the Catholic Answers question admits that. When I looked into this, they admit that it leads to a bunch of errors here. If you just sort of think about it, you'll just leave, well, how can I know anything? That's an objection which, quickly could be. And Graham Oppie does a very good job of sort of flushing that out. Now, he's actually an atheist, but he doesn't call himself he says he's an agnostic. He doesn't call himself an atheist because he thinks he declares too much and the word has changed in meaning to meaning too much. So he just calls himself that. So that's my overall comments on humility and sort of why I want to do this episode here. I think it's misapplied. G.K. Chesterton thinks it's misapplied in his book of Orthodoxy too. And he sort of predicts, in a sense, a lot of this discussion here. But then again, he doesn't do anything necessarily to sort of counteract or get away from it either. That's sort of my overall comments on humility. I would just say it's overrated. I would say in general, you sort of have to sort of deprogram yourself of some of the humility culture, which a lot of it is politically correct too. It's sort of one of the ways in which Christians and political correct people, they both agree in some sort of shame. They just sort of disagree. Like the conservative evangelicals and then the left wing might disagree over what you should be shameful about, but they do think you should have some amount of it. Now, maybe that's true. But that's my sort of closing comments here. Why I want to do this episode. Swithin?
I think really you should be the focus. Whilst humility, I think in abstract is a virtue, because I mean it's basically the mean between being arrogant and I don't know the right word, kind of chronic underestimation of your own abilities. I think the focus should just be on basically being truthful and saying the right things in the right context. And I think that's true. If that's the case, you would be humble. I think that's or relatively speaking. Now that said, I do though think there is a big sort of theological question, which is if God does exist, then the relative abilities of any individual human are insignificant in comparison to God. So I do think there's that theological question which matters. But then, practically speaking, would that change the way you did? Well, I suppose it's your reference point. So in the Christian theology, you reference Jesus and the death and resurrection, etc. So you could go there. Now, I do think that would make a practical difference in this context, although I don't know if it would make that much difference. But I would need to think about that more. And I'd just like to thank everyone thank you everyone for listening to this absolutely amazing podcast. And please share it with your friends and family so everybody can enjoy the amazingness that you have just experienced. And if you'd like to contact the show for any reason, please contact us at mindcrimelibetyshow@gmail.com. That's mindcrimelibetyshow@gmail.com.